Hi guys, welcome to my channel. Hopefully you like the video, and without wasting time, let's dive in. In the annals of crime, there are names that send shivers down the spine, names that evoke terror and revulsion. Among them stands Andrei Chikatilo, a man whose depravity knew no bounds. Chikatilo's case is a haunting example of the darkest recesses of the human mind. His crimes were not just acts of violence, they were manifestations of a deeply disturbed individual. Andrei Chikatilo was born into absolute poverty, even relative to the area and era in which he grew up. The village of Yabluchne, in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, had just recently suffered through the Holodomor famine, which had left as many as a quarter of the region's residents dead from starvation. Though never verified as true, Chikatilo's mother told him that he had an older brother who was murdered and eaten by his neighbors during the famine. During Chikatilo's childhood, even bread was often beyond his family's reach. His early diet included grass and leaves, and as a result, he became physically stunted and developed several medical disorders. Though an intelligent child, Chikatilo struggled socially. He was mocked and physically bullied at school. His home life was no better. He regularly wet the bed until adolescence and was beat by his mother each time. Despite these struggles, Chikatilo succeeded in school. He developed an interest in communist literature and graduated with good grades, but his inner turmoil began to manifest itself in many ways during his teenage years. Andrei discovered that he was impotent and could only obtain an erection through extreme means. His first sexual experience, at the age of 17, was when he forced himself upon an 11-year-old girl. After pinning her to the ground, he ejaculated while she struggled. He discovered that violence was the only way that he could become aroused. It would later become known that Chikatilo suffered from a disorder called hydrocephalus, which, among other issues, likely caused his sexual dysfunction. In 1955, at the age of 19, Chikatilo moved to the city of Kursk and entered into his first romantic relationship. The pair attempted to have sex at least 3 times, but each ended in failure. Without violence and coercion, Chikatilo was unable to maintain an erection. After a bit over a year, his girlfriend ended their relationship. Shortly after, Chikatilo left Kursk and moved to Nizhny Tagil for work, while simultaneously taking correspondence courses in engineering. After 2 relatively uneventful years, he entered into compulsory military service for a further 3 years. His service record was perfect, and upon his exit, Chikatilo joined the Communist Party and returned to his home village to live with his parents. Almost immediately, Chikatilo entered into another relationship. Like his first, this one failed due to his sexual failings. This time, however, his partner made Chikatilo's issues known to her friends. Chikatilo took great offense to this, and felt that the entire community was making fun of him behind his back. He became ashamed and suicidal, then fled town and moved to the city of Rostov-on-Don. The first few years in Rostov passed without incident. Chikatilo was reserved, particularly when in the presence of women, but showed no signs of what was to come. In 1963, he entered into an arranged marriage. Though still unable to have traditional sex, the couple managed to conceive 2 children through alternative means. Meanwhile, Chikatilo began to study again, this time focusing on Russian literature. He obtained his degree in 1970 and began a teaching job in nearby Novoshakhtinsk almost immediately thereafter. This is when the activities that Andrei appeared to have left behind for so many years re-emerged. While teaching in Novoshakhtinsk, Chikatilo regularly molested his pupils. His actions were widely known by both teachers and students, but he continued for over a year without any disciplinary action. It wasn't until early 1974 when, facing further accusations of sexual misconduct, Andrei was allowed to resign discreetly. He immediately found another job, this time at Technical School number 33, in the nearby town of Shakhty. It is in Shakhty where Chikatilo took his horrifying actions to the next level. No more than 2 months after arriving in Shakhty, perhaps emboldened by the lack of consequences he incurred as a result of his sexual assaults, he lured a 9-year-old girl to a house that he had purchased in secret. Her name was Yelena Zakotnova. He attempted to rape her, but was unable to achieve an erection. He choked her, stabbed her to death, and ejaculated onto her. 2 days later, her body was found in the Grushevka River. Chikatilo was immediately suspected. Blood had been seen near his home. He had been seen in the area on the day of the murder. Most damningly, he had even been spotted with the victim mere hours before her death. Despite this, Chikatilo wasn't the top suspect. The police preferred a man named Alexander Kravchenko, who had been previously convicted for a similar crime. Blood was found on a sweater belonging to Kravchenko's wife that matched the blood type of the victim, but this blood type was also shared with the owner of the sweater, Kravchenko's wife. Further, Kravchenko had an alibi for the time of the murder, backed by a number of his neighbors. Still, he was pressured into confessing to the murder. Though he later retracted his confession, Kravchenko was convicted and sentenced to death. Despite being innocent of this crime, he was executed a few years later. Later interviews would reveal that this first murder set Chikatilo down a path that he knew he would repeat for the rest of his life. He now understood that rape and murder would be the only way he could obtain sexual satisfaction. He claims that he initially attempted to resist these urges, but knew that they would overpower him. He knew that he would spend the rest of his life chasing this newfound high. Over the next 22 years, he would repeat himself with over 50 additional victims. Andrei Chikatilo's first murder whet his appetite, but he was not able to resist his urges for long. In 1981, he sought out another victim. This time, he chose a 17-year-old girl named Laris Tkachenko. He offered her vodka and lured her into a secluded part of a forest near the Don River. He attempted to rape her and initially failed. When she tried to scream, he filled her mouth with mud. Chikatilo strangled her to death, mutilated her body with his teeth, and attempted to cover the body in branches and leaves. Her corpse was discovered the next day, but this time Chikatilo was not suspected. Chikatilo struck again 9 months later. He spotted a 13-year-old girl named Lyubov Biryuk walking home alone. Now aware of the importance of preventing his actions from being witnessed, he waited until they were alone before dragging her into the bushes. He stabbed her repeatedly. Once dead, he attempted to carve out her eyes. Once again, Chikatilo was not a suspect in her death until years later. and several months later, he was observed by two detectives while attempting to lure women and masturbating in public at a bus station in Rostov. He was searched and found to be in possession of a long knife, some rope, and a jar of Vaseline. The detectives noticed that he closely resembled the description given of Dmitry Patashnikov's killer and decided to perform a blood test on Chikatilo. However, the blood types did not match. Chikatilo's blood was found to be type A, while the semen samples discovered on 6 of his victims was determined to be type AB. Though unknown at the time, Chikatilo was one of a very small percentage of people known as non-secretors, whose blood type does not match the type found in their other bodily fluids. The detectives ceased their investigation of Chikatilo in relation to the murders, though while in their custody, he was found guilty of a theft from one of his previous employers. He was sentenced to a year in prison, but would only serve 6 months. Despite having come so close to stopping Chikatilo's murder spree, he would go on to kill more than 20 additional people before finally being caught. Upon his release from prison, Andrei Chikatilo once again took a short break from killing. He finally struck again about 9 months after his release, while on a business trip in Moscow. He spotted a young woman named Natalia Poklistova near Domodedovo Airport, lured her into the woods, and stabbed her to death. The killing was immediately recognized as the work of the unknown serial killer. Believing the murderer to have flown to Moscow due to the proximity of the murder to the airport, detectives used flight records as the basis of their search. But Chikatilo had arrived by train. Chikatilo killed another young woman a few weeks later, leading detectives to increase their efforts to discover the identity of the serial killer. A newly appointed special prosecutor named Isa Kostoyev led the creation of a 65-page report detailing everything they knew about the killer and attempted to create a profile of his likely characteristics. The profile was shockingly accurate. He believed the killer to be an isolated man. He believed the killer to be about 45 to 50 years old. Chikatilo was 49. He believed that the killer was of above-average intelligence and that he was married with children. He believed that the killer was an impotent sexual sadist who used the murders as a substitute for normal sex. He knew everything about Chikatilo except who he was. Chikatilo was aware of the manhunt, as it had now begun to be widely publicized in the media. For this reason, he took another break, this time going almost a year before killing again. It wasn't until August of 1986 that Chikatilo killed again. For the first time, he made serious efforts to hide the body. While traveling far from Rostov in 1987, Chikatilo found 3 more victims, but none were linked to the serial killings by local authorities. At this point, detectives believed that the killer had either died or moved to another part of the Soviet Union. By 1988, Chikatilo had resumed his typical pace. Detectives began to close the gap by discovering a new piece to the puzzle. They noted that a vast majority of the murders occurred close to train stations. They began to surveil stations throughout Rostov in an attempt to discover the killer. Their strategy was to fill the larger stations with uniformed officers, while staffing the 3 smallest stations only with plainclothes officers in an attempt to convince the killer to strike at one of those stations. The plan succeeded to an extent. Chikatilo's next 2 murders were each at these smaller stations. But he still evaded surveillance and was not captured. Igor Rybakov, a plainclothes police officer surveilling Donlesko's station, spotted a man with stained clothes wash himself at a well on November 6, 1990. Suspicious, he interviewed the man, but found no reason to arrest him. Nevertheless, after letting him go, he filed a report stating that he had interrogated a man named Andrei Chikatilo. A week later, it was discovered that a young woman named Svetlana Korstik had been murdered on that day, just a few minutes' walk from Donlesko's station. Detectives examined the reports filed by officers on that day, and one name stood out, that of Andrei Chikatilo. They recalled that he had been arrested in the past on suspicion of the same group of killings, but was exonerated due to a mismatch of blood types. Though they did not have enough evidence to arrest him, they did decide to place him under surveillance. After 6 days of following Chikatilo, police spotted him approaching and attempting to lure several children. On November 20th, 1990, Andrei Chikatilo was arrested. Chikatilo denied any connection with the killings. Police took another blood sample, but the results were the same as before. They did not match the semen found at the crime scenes. Still, they were sure that they had their man. But under Soviet law, they could only hold a suspect for 10 days without either charging him with a crime or releasing him, and they had nothing but circumstantial evidence. Chikatilo pointed to the blood test results and the previous exoneration as evidence that he was being unfairly targeted, until a psychologist began to read Kostoyev's profile of the killer to him. Within a few hours, Chikatilo was in tears. On November 29th, the night before the 10-day period would have expired, he confessed to 34 of the 36 murders with which he was charged. It would be later discovered that the 2 murders he denied were in fact committed by somebody else. Over the next few days, he confessed to having been responsible for 22 additional deaths. He also shared some previously unknown details of his killings. He described how he would sit beside his victims as their hearts stopped beating, how he would cut off their genitals, lips, nipples, and tongues with his teeth, and how he would chew and occasionally swallow parts of his victims. While awaiting trial, he underwent a psychiatric evaluation. It was determined that he suffered from various disorders, mostly attributable to brain damage caused during his early childhood, but that he remained responsible for his actions and was fit to stand trial. Chikatilo did not appear to show remorse during his long and drawn-out trial, but also made no efforts to hide what he had done. He sang old communist songs, went on long, disjointed rants, and exposed himself to the courtroom. He stated, "What I did was not for sexual pleasure. Rather, it brought me some peace of mind," and explained that, "When I used my knife, it brought psychological relief. I know I have to be destroyed. I was a mistake of nature." Just prior to his sentencing, a relative of one of Chikatilo's victims attacked him with a large piece of metal. The assailant was not punished. On February 14, 1994, Andrei Chikatilo was executed. His total number of victims was 56, making him one of the most prolific serial killers the world has ever seen. And with that, Chikatilo's story ends. If you like the video, don't forget to press that like, and if you want to hear stories like this,